Okay, so welcome to class video for our online quarantine folks for history class. I'll put these together for each chapter. Chapter 23 is pretty long, so it's very likely, it depends on the tempo, but I may divide this one into two just to make them 45 minutes to an hour long or so. And I'll keep doing these until the quarantine's over. And you guys are back in class, which hopefully will be before the midterm. So with that, there's a couple things I got to do because you don't have access to certain things from home. So first, what you're going to see, right, here's the home page in Blackboard for our class. What I'm going to do is, other side, lessons. And now you go to the chapter materials, just like you've been doing for the text and the slides, especially those looking on in class. There are some slides for chapter 22. There's not very many. It was the very tail end of what we didn't cover. Really, I think the last class you guys were around, we got up to the picture of William Howard Taft and his gigantic bathtub. And so the next class, had you been there, was Misty Monteith was going to take everybody to the computer lab because I was going to be out of town. So you didn't miss much except for the working with the team part. And so I'm going to get to that in a second, but what you'll see here, let's go back to chapter 23. It's not in there yet, but what you're going to find as soon as I finish this and post it is there'll be a third element down below the slides themselves. You're going to see a link, and it'll take you to YouTube, and it's the video I'm doing right now. And I'll keep doing that. So if there's a part 1, part 2, I'll put them under the chapter 23, and each chapter up until the time you guys are back in with us will have a video associated with it. As far as the quiz, I emailed you kind of a rundown of the plan, and so I'm going to just email you the quiz the day we take it. I ask you to take it, honor system, but take it closed book like we would in class. But that's it. I mean, just do it, send it back to me, right? You can highlight the answers, however you want to do it. Just make it obvious what your answers are. And that way we'll keep up with those. And the last thing I have to do is, under the student presentations, right, there's some slides. I think we talked about these generic slides that you can download. There's a how to hyperlink tutorial to hyperlink a short video. But the sign-up sheet right now is just the generic that I printed out and passed around in class. So tomorrow, right, I'm time-stamping this, but the 29th of September, I'll pull the names off of the handwritten sign-up sheet and post it in here so that you guys can look at who your teammates are. That's probably going to be the most troublesome, I would say, part of this. But the good news is the presentations don't start till the end of October, and we'll have another online session, or a online computer lab session, and I'll wait till the quarantine is over. Right? If you guys have any updates, certainly send them my way as far as how you're doing. But I hope everyone's doing okay, and this is just a preventative measure. And we'll be back in a normal class as soon as we can. Okay, I think that's it for the tech side of things. If you think of anything else, shoot me an email. So let's do this. Let's start with the chapter 23, because this is what we're going to do on the 29th in class for the folks that are still with us. And it's really talking about World War I, and really the build-up to. Because if you think about World War I, the U.S., we played a part, but it wasn't an enormous part until the end. And then it really did become decisive. But the U.S. was not a huge player in the early part of the war. Turn the volume down just a little bit. And you'll understand this here, the old mustache, as we go through it. So one of the last slides in chapter 22, and again, I would just look through those. There's one, it's kind of a cool video. It's a fast, sped up trip through the Panama Canal, just to show you the scope and scale of it. And part of the reason I put that on there with the map, if you notice, it wasn't like they dug a canal completely across the country of Panama. They used quite a few of the natural waterways that were already there. And so we end up with this, a change in leadership in the presidency, mostly due to, one, Taft wasn't all that popular, But because of he and Teddy Roosevelt having a falling out, Roosevelt comes back and actually tries to run for a third term, which wasn't illegal back then, right? Not illegal, but it wasn't in the Constitution. So by doing that, he effectively splits those that were supporting the Republican Party, because he forms a no-kidding independent called the Bull Moose Progressive Party. Because the Republicans were like, no, man, we're not going to nominate you. We're nominating the incumbent president. Because there's a lot of power in being in the White House and getting reelected. And so that splits the Republican vote, and it allows the good cop, right? That's the whole idea behind this picture. This is Woodrow Wilson. And you can see these shady businesses, things like that, crooked businesses, food adulteration. Some of the things we talked about with Teddy, not only busting trust, but trying to make food and drugs and things like that, the primary function of government, safety of its citizens. And so that's what Wilson's doing. And behind him is the guy that has lost, right? Every election he's running pretty much, William Jennings Bryan. And we'll see him again in the 1920s up the street in Dayton, Tennessee. But anyhow, that was the propaganda poster, right? The campaign poster. Wilson's the good cop on the beat. It's kind of interesting they use that, since Teddy Roosevelt was actually commissioner of the New York Police Department. Yeah, I'm just going to put this in slideshow mode. There's not much else to look at. And I'll have to move my head every once in a while because it gets in the way. All right. As Wilson comes into office, there's kind of a change, not only in the party in charge. Now we have a Democratic president in the White House. But he's a critic of Roosevelt. Roosevelt using kind of that gunboat diplomacy idea. We'll use diplomacy, but we'll back it up with the M and dime, the military side. And if you didn't, again, I'll recommend going back and looking at the chapter 22 slides, because Roosevelt is very active, kind of a nationalistic, imperialistic wave in the Caribbean. And it doesn't really sit well. It makes the U.S. come across kind of as a bully with occupations and takeovers and things like that. But what Roosevelt uses for the rationale is, it's called the Roosevelt Corollary, but it goes along with the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, that said, Europe, keep out of the Western Hemisphere. You have no business here. But Roosevelt says, you know what, we have business in our own hemisphere, so we can act accordingly. And he probably goes overboard on that. Wilson's also a critic of Taft, using diplomacy again, but using the E this time, dollar diplomacy. It's a nice word for bribing in a way, whereas Wilson's more of a purist. Right? He came from an academic background. I want to say Princeton. He was the president of Princeton for a while. So he believes in negotiations, diplomacy, not economics behind it, not military behind it, just talking things out. He develops what becomes the Federal Reserve. And look at the top tax rate, 77%. And you're going to see part of the why. Now this encompasses his whole presidency, and he was president for 8 years, albeit the last few months he was pretty well incapacitated. But there was a debt after the war, and as we get into the interwar period, you're going to see what that's going to do to not only the United States, it helps kind of set us up for the Great Depression, but to the world. Okay. And he's also a bit on the maybe paranoid side, the Espionage Act, which is still with us today. There's elements of that associated with the Patriot Act that we know was post 9/11, and the Sedition Act, which has actually come up in current events. That word, sedition, it's a strange one, but it basically means acting to undermine the government. And who said it? It was an assistant to a cabinet position. I can picture the guy's face. I can't think of his name right now. But he was saying that those opposing some of Trump's plans were acting with sedition, trying to undermine the government. That's why the Constitution's there. Right? You can argue with the person, and that's what was going on. It wasn't an undermining of the Constitution. It had to do with these protests going on. Right? Wilson, remember, progressives were not strictly Republicans. It covered both parties, and he had a progressive slant to him as well, prescribing good behavior, which is interesting because if you read about Wilson, he was a bit of a racist as well. He had those Southern prejudices. But he starts to pick up on the idea of how powerful propaganda can be, and advertising and campaign posters and the like. And you're going to see that these two guys, Creel and especially Eddie Bernays, we're going to look at quite a bit, they figure it out because they work for the Wilson administration in kind of promoting the idea of the United States is finally going to have to enter World War I, because we had stayed out of it through the first 3 years effectively. So that's going on. And as the war president, I mean, he keeps us out of the war, and that was actually even a campaign slogan. Wilson, he kept us out of the war. But as the war progresses, and especially we see the German, the Central Powers, looking like they're moving toward a potential victory, it becomes more and more of an imperative that we join the war. And so look at that budgetary increase. War costs a lot of money. So that goes back to that tax increase as well. Right? So these quotes come from really the fallout from World War I. Some of you may have heard of Agatha Christie. She wrote mystery novels and the like. But World War I wiped out an entire generation of Europe, and it was far more bloody than the Civil War, which tends to be our kind of litmus test for how bad things can get. Well, there was one battle one battle, you call it the Battle of Verdun, that lasted 2/3 of the year, and both sides lost close to 500,000 people. So that's 1 million total. One battle eclipses the Civil War in the United States by, what, another 75%. So that's why she wrote that. To win is as bad as losing, because it was just a bloodbath. But these all come from Clemenceau, who we're going to see a picture of maybe at the end of the next video. But he makes these quotes. Catastrophic, really mistakes, you kind of stumble your way to victory. It's easier to make war than peace, especially once the war gets started, especially all this blood and treasures being sunk into trying to win the war. It makes it harder and harder and harder, to the point of it's impossible to make peace until one side is utterly and completely exhausted, financially, blood-wise, and treasure-wise, financially and the personnel. And you can tell he was not a big fan of military thinking at the time, and there's a couple examples of why he would be critical of. One is a guy named General Haig, who we'll see later. And this comes from a famous kind of, he was a student of Napoleon and wrote a book about war. And he said that war is really a continuation of politics. So that when, really what he's saying, and I think we can understand it, and it's not that strange of a concept, diplomacy, and when that breaks down, maybe the next piece is M, right, in dime, the military side. So when politics breaks down, if you still want to push your side of the issue, then maybe war is the next choice, using the military. So not all that earth-shattering, but people read that. It still gets quoted oftentimes. I don't know why it's a surprise to folks. If you understand dime, you understand exactly what Clausewitz is saying. All right. The end of the progressive era. I mentioned it in class. It's not that critical, and it probably went over your heads, but some will say 1916, some will say 1920. 1916 is when the U.S., the second election, or the re-election of Wilson and the movement toward war. Some will say 1914, the beginning of the war itself in Europe, and 1920 is kind of finally the women's right to vote, which was gaining momentum by the progressive era as well. But certainly these two pictures illustrate how the idea of progressivism, doing good by your people, can fall apart when there's war. And World War I very quickly devolves into trench warfare. We saw a prelude of this in the campaigns around Vicksburg in the Western Theater and around Petersburg, Virginia, toward the end of the war, when Grant was trying to finally get Robert E. Lee in a corner and end the war. Trench warfare. and now we see it on an even more massive scale. So this doesn't look like a whole lot of fun, right? Going over the top, as they called it. Let's go, boys. And you're going to see what they had to charge out of. And then just the kind of dreary, drab, nasty living conditions. And we'll spend a little time looking at what life in the trenches was like. This is an important concept, and there's a video that goes with it. When we get to the pages for the folks, if I embed the videos into the slides, I usually get some kind of kickback from YouTube where it's a copyright violation. So what I've done with my college success classes, this seems to work. I'll use those blue stars just like I do in class, and then when you guys go to the slides, you can click on those and watch them. Okay? And I'll explain what they are. You know, next chapter 24, I should probably put a little blurb next to the stars. This is one I would definitely watch. Some of the other ones are just kind of FYI. But this acronym of MAIN, right? Just like DIME, I would put this one down to memory. So what's pushing us toward war? And that video explains it better than I could, honestly. But ideas of militarism. Building up your military can be good for the economy, and it makes you feel like, you know, bigger man on campus. And especially if my neighbor, France or Germany, is building up, if I don't want to get steamrolled, I better build up along with them. So it's sort of an arms race piece. The second one is probably the most critical part of why World War I. All these alliances. So we have really two sides starting to develop. And they develop alliances, which says if you are attacked by the enemy side, I'm going to come to your aid. And so you can see how that can build a house of cards where now if one country in some grander alliance attacks the enemy side, everybody from both sides rushes in to defend their side of the argument. Right? And so these alliances, a lot of them were done in secret, so it wasn't clear what was going on, causes that house of cards to collapse, and within weeks, Europe's at war from a singular event, which you guys probably know, but we'll get to that as well. Imperialism, the expansion, right, taking over other countries. We talked about this in class. Resources, a prime driver. And there's a lot of imperial expansion into Africa at this point. And really, holding on to a small country on another continent, you can actually use that almost as an economic piece of dime, as an exchange. It's kind of cruel. What about the people living there, right? And then nationalism, like kind of hyper-patriotism, that idea. And you can see how that can help push people toward the idea of war. Especially, and this is almost always the case, people underestimate the cost in both blood and treasure. They overestimate their own abilities to win quickly and in a definite manner. And so they go in thinking this is going to be short, sweet, and we're going to win. Just like the Confederates, just like the Union in the Civil War. And they couldn't have been more wrong. Same with World War I. All right, so there's two sides to this. The Triple Alliance, also known, more commonly known, honestly, as the Central Powers. And this thing with Italy is very strange, because when you get to some of the charts, Italy ends up showing up on the side of what's known as the Entente countries. What can get confusing is we're probably more familiar with the two sides in World War II, the Allies and the Axis. And that's where this can get confusing. So I try to stick with the terms associated with World War I. The Central Powers, that's one side, and then what's known as the Triple Entente. This Entente Cordiale, right? It's French, but it's a cordial agreement. And so you see the three main combatants on the Entente side, which some people call the Allies, because that's the side we're going to join, the U.S., but that can get confusing, so we'll just try to keep it straight that way. But what you're also going to see is Italy, pre-war, moves down to Entente during the war, and you're actually going to see the Italian Prime Minister in Paris during the peace accords with the French, the British, and Woodrow Wilson, the Americans. Obviously, we're not on the list yet because we're not there yet. The Balkans is a section of lower Europe, if you will. If you imagine straight across The Adriatic from Italy, the boot of Italy, you move east. You've got places like Bosnia and Albania, Greece. Greece is at the end of the Balkan Peninsula, and that's a point of friction between Austria-Hungary and Russia, and that helps push toward war as well. So there's a map. Yep, head's in the way. It always is, man. It doesn't matter where. I could put it anywhere, and it'd be in the way. But so here's what I was talking about. Italy. So this peninsula, as it sticks down into the Med, is what's known as the Balkans. And notice, Germany, pretty good size. Austria-Hungary, kind of this conglomeration of city-states, really. Pretty big as well. But there's friction in here between Austria-Hungary, because this pink part's Russia. Right? What else? I think that's it. Yep. All right, just a little bit back home now. We're going to jump back and forth a little bit just to set the stage. But we're, remember Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Corollary, being active in Central America doesn't make us really great neighbors. Right? And so that's going to come into play when the U.S. decides to enter the war. But before that, we have a little civil war going on. Pancho Villa and his troops. Look at what they're doing. Murdering Americans. That's not going to go over very well, is it? The U.S. supports this guy, Carranza. And even he is not a fan of this Roosevelt Corollary, but he offers to help the U.S. and try to capture Pancho Villa. Right, so Wilson sends troops. Instead of working with Carranza, Wilson's like, nah, we got this. And so he sends this General Blackjack Pershing, who we're going to see leading troops in World War I in Europe. But he's unable to really track down and find Pancho Villa. And the U.S. and Mexico, I don't know really how close it was, but there was at least the potential, let's say, for going to war. Right? So what was Pancho Villa's purpose? Why would he sneak over the border into America and kill some Americans, which he knows is going to generate a response? Well, think about the two sides. Okay? He did that. He wanted to cause a conflict because he didn't like Carranza. So if I can make the two sides fight, it might make Carranza look bad and open up either himself or one of the people he was supporting. So that's why he was doing it. He was trying to stir the pot to make his opponent or his enemy look bad, Carranza. How does Mexico figure into U.S. entry into World War I? I don't know if we'll get to it in this slide, but here's a hint. It's called the Zimmerman Telegram. Right, and there's just a map of some of the goings-on with Pancho Villa and Blackjack Pershing trying to track him down. All right. But that's the best part, right? Oh, and in the way. Remember the first slide had the mustache? There's Pancho Villa. This guy's like, he's out of uniform, man. Where's your mustache? Everybody else is looking kind of grizzled and mustachioed and well-armed, I might add. Yeah? Little Pancho Villa. And another mustache. Okay, and this is the guy. This is the match that lights the fuse that explodes into World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, again with the very nice mustache. And as far as the Blue Star, this is a gag video. It's from, what is it, A Million Ways to Die in the West, the Mustache song. You can click it if you want. It's got some bad language in it, I'll just give you that. But this Blue Star video on the Franz Ferdinand page, this is the one that really, I think, does an excellent job at stepping through that acronym MAIN and why each of those pieces, militarism, alliances, my brain just went blank, nationalism, what was the last one? Help me out. Somebody give me the vibe. Why am I? Imperialism. Somehow internationalism. Like, is that even anything? Okay, moving on. It was a long weekend. I just got home last night at about 10 from that 4-day race up in Bowling Green. Did okay. Fastest classic, so I got a big trophy for that. Moving on. Who cares? Nice mustache though, right? So how does the assassination of this guy lead to a war that lasts 4 years, 65 million troops, 37 million casualties? I mean, just catastrophic to a generation of Europe. Well, it goes back to that acronym. And again, I said the A, alliances, was probably the biggest piece of that whole thing. And so this lights the fuse, but the stage had been set so that a singular event like this, maybe in a given set of circumstances, wouldn't have mattered on anything. But it brings us into World War I. I throw this picture in. It's a place I actually stayed at because the Balkans, I mean, it was originally called the Tinderbox of Europe because of all the different factions and elements within it. And we're going to see the guy that shoots Ferdinand Princip, Bosnian Serb with the black hand, a terrorist by any other name. And so all it took for that tinderbox to be lit was the assassination of the Archduke, who's in line to the throne of Austria-Hungary. But the interesting thing was when we were in Bosnia during the ethnic cleansing, right, the Bosnian, Serbian, Kosovo era under Bill Clinton, I actually stayed, it was that room, in the Elitsa Hotel because this was our compound for our special ops, trying to keep the sides from killing each other, from ethnically cleansing. And so the Elitsa Hotel, why is that significant? That's where Archduke Ferdinand stayed the night before he rode out in a carriage with his wife and was killed in Sarajevo. So this building was right on the outside the perimeter. You can't see it, but over this tree line and a little bit over in this direction was the main airport in Sarajevo. So that's what put us here as well. So interesting. But that's what Sarajevo looked like. The compound was fine. That hotel, being historic, was spared. But most of Sarajevo looked like this, and it was the saddest thing, driving out into the city that had just held the Winter Olympics, 12 years before? And there wasn't a building that had glass, that was all blown to pieces. And you look at that and you go, boy, that's terrible. But now look at it and understand there's people living there. Because where are they going to go? And seeing kids out trying to be kids. And as we sat, let me go back. We'd sit out at night, and there were some picnic tables over here. And just like smoke a cigar and talk, and you could hear the temperature. This area is fairly high up, terrain-wise. It's not huge mountains, but pretty good size. And so it cooled off quickly at night. When the temperature dropped rapidly, you could hear landmines exploding. And there were landmines on the airport over here that they hadn't been able to get rid of. At what point this area was the most heavily landmined, is that a word, area in the world. Let me turn off my fan. Probably got some background noise. And it was, you guys are too young for it, but Princess Diana made that one of her big causes, was to eliminate all the landmines that were in this Bosnia-Herzegovina area because it was killing little kids. If it would just temperature change, or they go out and play and they don't know it's there, or they play with it. And in fact, I just remembered this. One of the elements of special ops in the Army is civil affairs and PSYOPs, it's called, psychological operations. And that sounds nefarious, and sometimes it is, producing propaganda. But what these guys did at the time was they made comic books with, like Superman and Spider-Man, and it was in all the different native languages of the area, and trying to get kids to understand that these things are not toys. Don't go out and poke a landmine. Right? I know it sounds kind of crazy, but I don't know. I hope it helped a little bit. All right, the Great War, the Great Head. Your Entente countries, notice, I talked about Italy. We started off, it was over here. But Italy kind of stands back for a minute and goes, maybe this is not such a good idea. And they were promised some territory if they would move and help the Entente countries. And that's ultimately what they end up doing. Now, they're not a huge player, but there's almost a constant battle along their northern border, and you can see the casualties, the deaths from Italy, nothing to sneeze at. Excuse me. But notice the United States, again, very late to the war. So compared to the big three, if you will, especially in Italy, they paid the price. And of course, the two primary combatants here are Germany, Austria, Hungary. Yes, the Ottoman Empire, what you would know today as Turkey, was part of it as well, but the Ottoman Empire was on its way to utter collapse at this point. So they don't really have the fighting power or the political power to stay together and do a lot. So obviously Germany bears the brunt of. And sometimes remember the video of the Civil War soldier Sullivan Ballou writing home to his wife and how we try to humanize war, not just make it a numbers game. I'm guilty here. It is kind of a numbers game, but if you look at total mobilized, those called up to fight, killed or died, wounded, prisoners, so that's where you get the whole casualty count. Missing in action is a casualty. And so look at the totals. And then go one more line. Look at the percentage of the people mobilized that were casualties. That's an astronomical number. It's over 75%. Russia, France. The British less so. And if you notice the United States, much less so. Again, not to minimize our contribution, but getting there late, especially after the bloodbaths of Verdun and the Somme, were beneficial to our side. And then you can go down and see Austria-Hungary, 90% of those mobilized. And so the grand totals, mobilized, 65 million. Casualties, 37.5 million. And that's adding up both sides. That's a staggering number. And no wonder Agatha Christie wrote, war winning is just as bad as losing. How did this happen? Let's step through this. It's not the most exciting thing, but the idea of how these alliances slowly came together. Right? And so you see, there it is again, Italy. They're on the side of what becomes the Central Powers. Okay? This is the idea of an alliance right here in writing. We will promise mutual support in the event of an attack by any of the two others, basically those on the other side. Now at this point it's any two, but that's going to change. So we can see the two sides already picking sides in effect. Right? And look, France. Germans and the French, they still don't like each other all that much. There had been, and this is eerie, it kind of preludes another one, that it wasn't not signed. Adolf Hitler just ignored it in World War II. But in World War I, or leading up to this reassurance treaty, Russia and Germany said, hey, we'll just leave each other alone. And by 1883, the Germans refused to sign it, so that treaty dissolves. It's no longer in effect. And now we see France and Russia sign. Right? When this one falls apart, we got to start building up alliances with other people that'll work with us. And what you'll see is a map makes it really clear how this can not work out well for Germany, Austria, Hungary. Right? I'm going to pause for a minute. My mutts are barking. Why do dogs insist on barking at the mailman? And they'll probably keep it up till she goes back the other way down our street. So you get to hear my dogs bark. Look at that. Even Japan was involved in World War I. Not dramatically, but they were part of the overall picture as well. And there you go. There's that Entente Cordiale, the cordial agreement. So Britain and France set aside their colonial, their imperialistic differences, and now they're locked together. And so we're moving from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and you can see the two sides really developing at this point. This really shows it as well as anything. What do you notice? And again, Italy, before the war, is on the side of the Central Powers. This is going to happen again in World War II, but look. The Central Powers are surrounded, and Britain off to the side, and then the U.S. way over here. And here's your Balkan Peninsula again. And that shows it a bigger picture of it. Here's your Ottoman Empire, Turkey, right? The Black Sea, Russia. Uh-oh. Yep. You click on the picture, it tries to take you to the link. So how did this happen? We keep trying to answer that question. Look closely at these guys. Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar, because the Tsarist regime is going to collapse under the weight of World War I. with King George V. One, stellar mustaches. Two, do they look like brothers? Pretty close, huh? They're first cousins. And so we have kind of this intermingling of the hierarchy, the royalty of Europe. And even between England, Russia, okay, they're on the same side, right? The Entente countries. Guess who else is related? And again, with a stellar mustache, coming in first place in the mustache contest, Kaiser Wilhelm, the leader of Germany. It's hard to tell, but it looks to me like that's like against the face. Wouldn't that be cool if this part of it was like sticking out away from his face? Like, oops. When you bang the microphone, it takes a while to come back. Notice, eldest, his mother was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. You got Prince Albert in a can, better let him out. So you can see this kind of intermingling of the royalty. And you go, well, geez, if they're all related, why couldn't they solve this without a bloodbath? Well, think about you if you have brothers and sisters. How well do you get along sometimes? So the idea here, there's a lot of stuff, but the point is, we saw the kind of drawing of lines, and that took, 20 years from the 1880s to the early 1900s. But the pace starts to quicken. And so there's this thing called the Schlieffen Plan that's drawn up 10 years before the war starts, but it's a plan of how to invade through Belgium and into France. So that tells you that the Germans are at least thinking about this. Okay? And now we add Russia to the mix. Britain and Russia sign with France. Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's in the Balkans. And we know that's a friction point between Austria-Hungary and the Russians. Right? It ended up, they'll say, we'll maintain status quo, meaning kind of how things are right now, but that's going to change, and that's going to help quicken the pace as well. We see Germany introducing a new tax and finance system to grow their armies, militarism. And then the French respond in kind. They increase your military service. You're drafted, now you got to serve for 3 years. So it looks to me in the crystal ball like they are looking toward war. Now, it's not a done deal yet, but you can see the dates. So it's just around the corner. And so the match being lit. Again, this is an eye chart. Doing it one bullet at a time is fine in class. You guys can read through it. And so you see the lighting of the match, the assassination of the Archduke. Right? And the point of this is not to remember all this stuff, because it's not super relevant. We know there's alliances built in here, but look at the tempo. It's like a day, 2 days, a day, 2 days, a day, 2 days. Pretty soon, the key thing is, you know what an ultimatum is? It's like your parents, clean your room or else. The responses to these, they're given a couple days to respond to an ultimatum of, hey, you're going to really become part of Austria-Hungary. Right? We're sick of messing about here. And that upsets that status quo thing between Austria-Hungary and Russia. Right? And so what happens? This rejection of the ultimatum, the rejection of an international conference, a group of outsiders to come in. Let's all get around the table, use diplomacy, and stop this before it gets out of hand. Bam. There's your key event. So a month, right, between the Archduke being assassinated and Austria-Hungary declaring war. So that's not a whole lot of time to settle these kind of long lingering disputes, especially with alliances on top of all this. And so as soon as that's done, now Russia's going to start to mobilize, because they're afraid those Balkans, if the Austria-Hungary is going to grab them up. And you can see the house of cards come down again. And this time it's, 2 weeks effectively. Germany declares war on Russia. Germany declares war on France. Britain declares, right? I'm coming to the aid of my alliance partner. And so it doesn't take long. Europe's at war with itself. Now the question at the bottom, who's missing? We are, right? The United States, not part of this. Don't even want to be part of it. So on this side of the pond, the American reaction to it. Here we go again. But if you look historically, just look between the British and the French, quite honestly. The constant state of warfare in Europe. And the U.S., we're isolated. The oceans around our shores. We don't want any part of this mess. We're above such savagery. Okay. But Wilson does declare us neutral, and we're going to stick with that. And most people agree with it. Now, there's biases on both sides. There's people that support the Entente. There's people that support the Central Powers. And most of that it comes down to where they were born and raised, right? What their ethnic background is. So let's talk a little bit about this Schlieffen Plan. How do I do it, man? It's like no matter. Oh, there you go. How about that? Nah. Good. Yeah, look at this picture. One, it's not as easy to tell, but he has a mustache. It looks like he's holding a mop. That's just his killer hat. Right? But here's what he came up with. And the idea, anytime you have a plan of any kind, it has some assumptions built in. But he had a couple that were probably fatal, flaw-wise. And so we're going to win this two-front war because, remember, go back to the map, Germany, Austria-Hungary are stuck between France and Russia. So they've got a two-front war from the word go. So how can we win that? Because that's normally not a good position. And that's what we did in World War II, right? The Russians are pushing back from Stalingrad, Leningrad, and the U.S. lands on Normandy to open up a two-front war. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to hit France first. We're going to roll through Belgium into France, take Paris. Paris falls, and the French are going to surrender by 42 days from the word go. Month and a half, right? Okay. And the reason they had to do it, this speed was necessary because as soon as they attack France, who's going to come to their aid? The Brits, right? And the Russians. And so we've got the Russians over on the other front. So that's a problem. So we've got to kick the French in the tail, win, have them surrender so that we can redeploy back to the Eastern Front and stop the Russians before they can push into our territory. So that's a big assumption, and of course it doesn't work. And so this dependence on invasion, surrender, redeployment, and all to happen super quickly is the flaw in the Schlieffen Plan. And that's, we ultimately see the results when the Western Front just bogs down into 4 years of trench warfare. So here's your picture of said plan. Oops. Through the Ardennes, through Belgium, sweep in, take over France. It's a little hard to see. That's Paris right there. And so you can see they're actually going to sweep through beyond and then redeploy back through Germany to the other side, the other front that's bound to develop when the Russians attack. Right. There it is. Is it going to work? Survey says no. And part of the reason why is simple things. One of those is this. It's a taxi. And so as the Germans, yes, the initial wave of the Schlieffen Plan was successful. They pushed through Belgium and into France, but they're stopped before they get to Paris. And why? Because the French were able to mobilize quicker, more effectively than the Germans had planned for. One of the reasons why was they used anything that could move troops to get them out toward the front. And now as the front gets closer to Paris, that move is less and less distant. But what's happened on the German side? The more they move closer to Paris, their supply lines are getting longer and longer and becoming more frail. And so things like this can change the tide, and they did. Now, it wasn't just the taxis, but anything, trains, right? Moving people to where you need them, moving troops to where you need them. And here's a few German combatants. You see quite a few mustaches. The yellow arrow, take a look at that face. Who is that? It's Adolf Hitler. Notice he's got the full-on kind of Kaiser Wilhelm mustache going here. But guess what? When we start using chemical warfare in war, and you got to wear a gas mask so you don't breathe it in, that mustache might not be the best thing to wear because it can cause the seal on your face to leak. So that's why even in the U.S. military still, I don't have it now, but you had to have your mustache shaved at the edge of your lip for that very reason. So what happens? Hitler gets inhales some chemicals during the war and is in a hospital and blind for a little bit. Now, I don't know that he was completely on his deathbed, But while he's in there, he's stewing on things that are going to come to fruition in the 1930s and 40s. There he is. And look, every picture always has some kind of dog in it, right? We're going to see another one. This is Hermann Goering, a fighter pilot during World War I, who eventually will become the head of the Luftwaffe in World War II. And an interesting picture. There's, warfare does generate some new, I hate to say creative, but they tend to be ways to move or kill each other. But this was an attempt by the Germans to make some sort of like pontoon floating boat shoe. And the guys on Mythbusters, if you ever watched that show, actually tried this. And since there's no resistance to push against, you basically kind of shuffle and fall over. So this was a fail. But no dog, but it's like, okay, dude, what's this guy in the little, it's like the world's smallest boat back here in the background? Who knows, right? There's probably a reason to put that in there, maybe for scale, I have no idea. All right, so there's two fronts, and you can see that from the map, even before the match was, the fuse was lit by the Archduke. And so we're going to have war on the Western Front, war on the Eastern Front, not quite as long because it spells the end of the Tsarist Russian Empire. But we'll look at those two independently. And look, you could look at battles in World War I for 2 years, just a semester at least. And there's no way to do that in a survey type course. So what I want to focus on is a couple key battles, one on the Eastern Front and then 4 on the Western Front. And you can see where it's located. Here's Germany, and again the Schlieffen Plan would have brought us down through Belgium, into France, through Paris, redeploy, back into Germany, and a little reference here, Switzerland, right, the Alps. But notice this trench, the Western Front becomes so entrenched that it stretches from the North Sea, from the coast. Here's Dunkirk. We're going to see that in World War II, all the way down through to Switzerland. Holy moly. And you can see the concentration in the center of the line. And there's a little town called Verdun. We're going to get there. Where's Ypres? Here it is. Oh. And with 2 screens, it's easy to put the pointer on the wrong one. You guys don't see anything. I'm like, here it is. You're like, whoa, where? See the arrow? A town called Ypres. We're going to get to that one too. So, first battle of the Marne, the area in and around the Marne. And part of the stopping of was the speed of deployment of French. And there were some actually expeditionary British troops as well that were kind of a speed bump. You hate to say that, but they did slow the movement through Belgium and the northern part of France that helped kind of not cause the Schlieffen Plan to fail entirely, but certainly didn't help it act as it should have, or as it was planned. Taxi cabs, yep. And so this kind of stabilizes. Yes, of course, the front moves, it ebbs and flows a little bit. But for 4 years, we're going to fight over this terrain. And imagine what that does, what the terrain's going to look like. It becomes called no man's land because there's nothing alive on it. Yep, rail system. The other thing was the Russians were much quicker to mobilize than the Schlieffen Plan had anticipated. So now, not only do we sweep through France and have them surrender, but the Russians are already on our Eastern Front before we can do anything. It's starting to look bad already. Lack of flexibility. When you have a plan, you should have, well, what if this doesn't happen? What if this doesn't happen? What are we going to do? Plan B, right? Plan C. If all you've got is plan A and it doesn't work, now what? So they're stuck. Unsecure communications, longer and longer logistical lines, supply lines. And so I'm able to tell what they're trying to do because they don't have secure communications. And I can interdict or interrupt their supplies, which makes life miserable for the guys on the front. Right? So result, stalemate, trench warfare. This is what no man's land looks like. It's a place called Flanders Field. And we'll get to that again. I'm hitting about the 50-minute mark, so I may stop when we get to new weaponry and make a part 2 on this. But again, this back and forth, constantly fighting across this area, because you've probably got a trench on the near side and one on the far side. And so we're going to go over the top, charge across this area through barbed wire, through machine gun nests, eventually through chemical warfare attacks. No wonder it looks like hell. Maybe this will be a good point to end. Talk about the trench, and then we'll pick it up from there in part 2. It's an oversimplification, the idea of a singular trench, and I'm guilty of promoting that a little bit. Those pictures at the beginning of the slides, that single trench, but it wasn't. It was a complex piece of trenches, especially, in the areas in and around Verdun where they were so heavily fortified, so many troops. So you've got this frontline trench, and that's kind of what we were looking at in the picture. Right, and that's where you're going to go over the top, out the trench. You have built-in pathways because this is your own side's barbed wire. So there's ways to get through here that only you know, theoretically. And then across this no man's land into an enemy trench, which the German trenches were actually even better than the Entente countries. And you're going to try to attack through that same mess, through the machine gun nests that are in here, through artillery fire as you're coming across the trench. It's just a meat grinder is the only way I could describe it. But you can see the interlinking of the front trench with more of a supply or support trench. You've got areas to put stuff because you're here, and then back to the artillery, and then there was a supply line ammo dump off the backside. And so what would happen was there was kind of a cycle to this whole thing. You can't have people up on the front lines the whole time. They'll go crazy, right? Battle fatigue, shell shock, they called it back in World War I. They'll lose their marbles, and some people did. And so you fight here for however long is prescribed, 5 days, and then you move back, and then maybe you get some R&R, or you go back to the supply line to try to keep folks from losing their wits from constant barrages of fire and going across the no man's land. And then a kind of a cross section of a slice of that front trench. I've got some pictures that illustrate what these bolt holes are. They're just dig out the side of the trench, and you can put stuff in there. You might be able to crawl in under a bombardment, get in there and sleep if nothing's going on. And you can see your machine gun nests. So this would be the over the top through and onto your enemy front line. Right, bolt holes, trench board, because I want it tall enough where I can stand here, my head's not sticking up so it doesn't get shot off, but enough where I can get up and over the top. And they tried this, a sump. Just think about it. You dig this big ditch and it starts raining, and in Europe it rains a lot. So it's going to fill up with muddy water, and worse, right? Dead bodies, dead rats, human waste. And that's where the term, it's a medical disease called trench foot. If you keep your foot wet long enough, the skin just kind of falls off the bone, right? But that's why. And so the idea was if we can put a sump, maybe drain the water away. Well, no, it would have had to have been one hell of a sump to be big enough. So here, back to that first picture, this kind of front wall. And you can see guy sleeping here, looks like. Is it somebody up here? Maybe. This dude, hard to tell if he's asleep or dead, right? A lot of the time in the trench was pretty dull until it was time to go over the top, or there was an enemy attack coming inbound that you were trying to fight off. But now imagine 2 or 3 inches of rain day after day, what this would look like. Here's a bolt hole. See the guy kind of hanging out in that cutout area I was talking about. A much more rudimentary trench. That first one looks like it does have some wood, right? And it's been built, a little bridge across it, sticks for support. This one, much more, maybe either freshly dug or they just didn't have the materials at that point to reinforce it. And I put this picture in as like dinner time at the trench. These are rats that they caught, that they hung up to dry. Dinner time, ring the dinner bell. You can tell he's French because he has a ridiculous hat. Yeah, I think we'll step through these and then we'll pause it. This will be part 1 because we've kind of set the stage for all the different, the buildups, the alliances, the treaties that were breaking down, the beginning of the war itself, what the trenches look like, and then these new weapons. And we talked about this in the Civil War, but you see it again even more pronounced in World War I. The idea of new weapons using old tactics. And so let's throw this into the mix and think what it'll do to old tactics, right? Napoleonic warfare. That's sort of what we're doing. Now, we're not marching in big phalanxes of 3 deep across an open field like the Redcoats, bang, right? Retreat, reload, fire. But we're trying to run across a no man's land with this stuff out there in development. So you have chlorine mustard gas, both of which, when you inhale them, they destroy your lungs. Believe it or not, when I was in Iraq the last time, there were insurgents. They were, you've heard about the IEDs, the roadside bombs, that kind of thing. Well, they were making them, and they were getting their hands on, not chlorine like the powder you put in a swimming pool, but tanks of chlorine gas, and they were building these IEDs with chlorine gas tanks around them to try to use an old kind of style chlorine chemical warfare against us. We were able to put a stop to that. Flamethrowers, right? You see those much more in World War II. First tanks, they're somewhat comical. So were the same airplane. Airplanes were kind of comical. They were like kites with a motor on the front. But the development of tanks in battle, right? Airplanes in battle. Now I've got this new thing, an airplane. What do I do with it? And again, people are very creative about thinking about ways to use it to kill the enemy. It starts out, airplanes are primarily used for reconnaissance and what they call artillery spotting. So you watch your side's artillery from an airplane and it's landing 100 yards too far. So you scribble something down with a rock, right? Put it in a bag, fly over your line, your headquarters, and drop it 100 yards too long. And they can adjust the artillery fire that way. X-rays, so we see some advancement in medicine, not quite as bad as the Civil War, and blood banks, because this is, if nothing else, a bloody war. Okay, so just a couple pictures to kind of wrap us up here. A tank, and this is not one of the first ones. They were even more ridiculous looking, but you can see the idea that it's got kind of a ramp on the front to get over or through trenches, things like that. This was probably some kind of either mechanism for laying barbed wire or cable behind it. A lot of times tanks were kind of used as a moving shield as you moved across no man's land. But you can see, look, the effects of all that rain and how nasty the area becomes. So here's a turret, a gun turret on the side. They hadn't quite figured out the center fully rotating turret yet. The Blue Star videos are videos of different elements used during the war. A couple on the airplane and one just on some of the inventions of. So you're welcome to watch those. This is a model, but this is what was known as the Sopwith Pup. It was one of the early aircraft, and you can see it's a wooden frame with fabric stretched across it and a small motor in the front. And again, used for reconnaissance initially, but eventually as airplanes got up, when they first started, no kidding, the guys from either side, it was kind of gallant, right? These were like the knights of the air. And they'd wave to each other. But then they figured out, I can drop a rock with a message to my headquarters. What if I drop something that goes bang on the enemy side? And they come up with these things called flechettes, which I'll show you a picture of, which is even worse. And that's like, well, if they're going to drop bombs on our guys, we ought to be able to shoot them down. And so you see the evolution of. And believe it or not, the first airplanes, they mounted a gun here. But the problem is, if I'm shooting from this position on the fuselage, the bullets are going to go straight through the propeller arc, because when the propeller's spinning, right, it just looks like a solid piece. And so they were finding they were shooting their own propellers off. So solution one, well, let's put some steel reinforcement plates on the back of the propeller. So now at least if the bullet hits it, it goes ping off on its own. But now I have the capacity probably to shoot myself down. And so they finally figured out one of two solutions. One, put the guns up here on the top wing so it's above the propeller arc, right, the circle of the propeller. The other one was, and much more clever, I guess, was an interrupter gear. It was like a camshaft so that the gun would fire and the bullet was synchronized with the propeller. So it would go between the two blades, even when it's spinning at 3,000 RPM, whatever it was. Flamethrowers, wouldn't want to be on the end of that. Another French with the ridiculous helmet. And of course, chemical warfare. And the thing with chlorine and mustard gas, one, especially if it's calm, you can see how it kind of just lingers. And anytime there's a new development, I've got to come up with some countermeasure for that development, so the gas mask comes into being. But this stuff was also heavier than air. It would sink down into the trenches and the foxholes. So it was deadly. If you didn't have your chem gear and you got attacked with this stuff, you were doomed. Let's end with this Grimno. This is a flechette. And I was talking about dropping things out of airplanes. It's like, when I was a kid at least, they had it. It was lawn darts. And they probably have some kind of safe version now. But it was basically a big dart. You'd throw it and try to get it in a circle on the other side of the yard. Well, what they did with airplanes is they started building them bigger. Effectively a bomber, right? It was still a kite, but a bigger kite. And they'd have boxes of these flechettes and fly over the enemy trenches and dump these boxes out. These are extremely heavy darts, effectively. And so if you got hit with one of these, I don't care if you're wearing that ridiculous helmet or not, it's going to go through your helmet, through your head, and come out your butt. Right? Nice. Yeah, that's a terrible image to end on. But nonetheless. All right, so we'll end with this for part 1, right at the hour mark. We'll pick it up and talk about the bigger battles, 1 on the east, 4 on the west. And then the main part of this, really, not main the acronym, but the focus is the outcomes of the war and how dreadful that was prosecuted to the point that World War I and World War II are directly connected to each other. All right, so we'll get to that on the next video. All right, signing out here, and I'll see you in the next one.